Moving on with polling, we're going to be looking at sampling respondents and like what that looks like and question types. All right, 4.19, polling sampling respondents. All right, so what does that look like? All right, first off, backside. So respondents means like who do you ask the question to? Well, one, if you ask it to just like any adult, anybody in the country, just any adult, it's probably the least accurate poll in terms of predicting election results because like 40% of adults don't even vote. Sometimes up to 50% don't vote at all. So that's the least accurate. If you ask registered voters, that's good, but there's about 40% of registered voters who don't actually go out and vote. And if it's a midterm election, it's higher than that. It's usually 60% of registered voters don't vote. So that's not great. And then lastly, the most accurate poll is if you actually ask likely voters. That would be the most accurate poll. Now, by the way, if you're doing a poll about like, does someone like a brand of shoes, then asking just random adults is fine. But if you're trying to find out political opinions and how that impacts voting, then likely voters is the most accurate. But it's also harder to do the polls because it's harder to find those people. And therefore, it also means it's more expensive. So usually likely voter polls, you're not going to see them until closer to election day, which is another reason why polls really much before a couple months or a month and a half before an election are not super accurate, generally speaking. All right, respondents also. When you're trying to get respondents to a poll, you're going to need the correct amount of party, race, age, and income. If you have too many Democrats, the poll's going to be skewed. If you have too many Republicans, the poll's going to be skewed. If you have too many of one, if it's all white people, that's skewed. If it was heavily black in an area that isn't as heavily black, that would make that skewed. So like any race or income level, that'll skew the poll. So you got to try to scientifically make sure you get the right amounts of people to sample that. There are two types of polls in general that when we're looking at type of respondents that you're looking for, the most common one is what we just call a mass survey. And it just means like the general population is polled. And that's most polls that you run into. It's just a mass survey. They're just surveying as many people as they can find in the general population. But there is one type of polling that's a little more specific, and it can be useful, especially to a political candidate. And that's what's called a focus group. And then you have a small selected group polled, usually independent or undecided voters are more typical for a focus group, and you bring them in front of a person who's running the focus group, and you ask questions to them to kind of gauge like what their opinion is. And so you see here in the picture, there's a guy, Frank Luntz, who does a bunch of focus groups for all the different media outlets, and he often does these polls where they watch a bunch of independent or undecided people watch a debate, say together, and then he questions them and asks what they like. And candidates can learn things from that. But remember, you're only talking like 25 people. All right, but that's a focus group. Usually, if you do a focus group, by the way, you get paid for it. So that's kind of fun. All right, cool. Let's go to the next thing. Look at this poll and specifically look at the internals. Remember, the internals are usually at the bottom of the poll, underneath the poll. I reprinted them at the top and made them larger just so it's a little easier. And it was just asking the question, who should run for president in 2020? This was a poll that was done in February of 2019. High Point University did the poll. Quite a few universities do polls. And it says a phone call of 439 North Carolina adults, margin of error 4.7%. So when you look at this poll, what might be some problems with it right off the bat? One, there's not a lot of people in the poll, 439. And then two, it's just adults. So it's probably not the most accurate in terms of like likely voters who are actually going to show up and vote in a presidential election. So yeah, those are a couple problems that I would see with this poll. And that's something that I want you to be able to analyze and look at. All right, cool. Let's go to the next thing. All right, 4.20. This is the last card of this short lesson. Poll question types and format. So the questions matter and the format of the question matters. And sometimes you can learn a lot more by how the question's asked. And sometimes you ask it a certain way and you're going to kind of get a little bit of a biased result. So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right, so we have what's called the horse race poll. And that's just like A or B. Do you want Trump or do you want Clinton? And that's the horse race. This is the most common type of poll, especially in political elections. And the media really, really love these polls because they emphasize the horse race. The media emphasizes who's ahead, who's behind, and they really don't talk much about policy or what the plan is for the candidates on healthcare or education or whatnot. What they're focused on is who's ahead, who's behind, who's ahead, who's behind, which isn't terribly useful in terms of deciding your vote. I mean, if you just decide your vote on who's ahead or who's behind, you probably need to, do a little more research and learn about policies. All right, but that's what the media focuses on because they're just looking at headlines. A poll that's maybe a little bit more useful is what we call multiple choice poll, where there's probably like four answers, and they usually look something like this. They strongly approve. APP for me is just approve. So when you're writing that, you can write out the word approve if you want. Strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, somewhat or strongly disapprove, etc. Okay, I didn't put strongly disapprove on there, but you get the point. And what's good about this is it captures variations in opinion. It's not just yes or no. Yes, I support Trump, or no, I don't support Clinton, or yes, I whatever it is. It's a little more like, yeah, I somewhat disapprove of this policy, or I strongly approve of it. So those are good things to know. And then there's another type of poll format that's called a push poll. And this one's kind of dirty, and in some states it's actually illegal to do a push poll. But it's where somebody calls you up to poll you, and they push you into a position by focusing on some sort of negative characteristics to influence the respondent. So they focus on negative characteristics to influence you, the person who's responding. And I'll give you an example of like a question that would be like a push poll. So, would you be less likely to vote for candidate A if you knew he had an affair with his secretary? So, so he's like throw in like some dirty laundry in there, about one of the candidates, and you're like, oh no, I'd be less likely, So those are push polls. Again, illegal in quite a few states, but something that you could come across. And obviously the results of a poll like that is not terribly good. And the last thing here is to remember, the wording of the question matters to the result. So you may ask a question in a certain way that gets you the result that you want. But if someone else does it and they ask the question a little different, well, then it's a little clearer, or maybe it's less clear, and so they get a different result. And I want to show you a couple of examples of that, just how the type or format of the question or how you word the question can really matter to results. So let's look at the first example. So this was done. These are all polls that asked about either a border fence or a border wall, and it was done between all polls between 2005 and 2018. And what's interesting is if you ask people if they support a border fence on the American southern border, 49% of people said yes, I support that. But if you said wall, it was 38%. So just the difference in words made a difference. Maybe they there's association of wall with the Berlin Wall, and that's bad, so therefore they support it less. I'm not really sure, but it's just funny how like the one word difference you can change like the result of what people believe. Another example is on abortion. I showed you a poll on abortion earlier, and I'm going to kind of make a contrast with this one with that poll from earlier. But this question is just a horse race poll. Are you pro-choice or are you pro-life when it comes to the abortion issue? That's it. A or B. And you'll notice that it's 48-48. So you're like, wow, there's just as many pro-life people as there are pro-choice people. It's a very even issue. And actually, if you look going back, it's been going back here 20 years, and it's pretty even all the way through. Although back in 94, 95, it looks like it was quite a bit more pro-choice. Now, change the question and make it more multiple choice format where you get multiple questions. And this is the one I showed you earlier where it says, I'm sorry. Here's what it said. Here's this question says, should it be legal in any circumstance, which would mean like all 9 months, legal in only certain circumstances, so people might only think the first 3 months, or illegal in all circumstances. And now look how that breaks down. So 50% of people think that abortion should be legal, but only under certain circumstances. That's really different because only 29% think abortion should be legal in any circumstance. And then there's 18%, obviously a very small minority, who think it's illegal all the time in all circumstances. So that captures a little bit more of the variety of answers when it comes to an issue like abortion, where the horse race A B question doesn't get you as much. All right, cool. Hopefully that is illuminating in terms of learning more about polls, questions, the format, and how that can impact the type of result you get.